Some people fear President Trump's decision to pull out of the nuclear deal could set off a war in the Middle East. Joining me now from Washington to discuss how Iran might respond is Bessma Momani. Bessma is a senior fellow at the Center for International Governance and Innovation in Waterloo, Ontario. Bessma, welcome to you.
Thank you. Hello.
I was just talking with Paul Heimbecker, former policy advisor, Brian Mulroney, former ambassador to the UN, Canadian ambassador to the UN, and he says if you follow this, the worst case scenario here, you could end up with a war in the Middle East. And tonight we're seeing what appears to be escalating conflict between what we're hearing are Iranian forces based in Syria and the Israelis. What's your assessment of this situation?
Yeah, I agree. I think that we're seeing a lot of tit for tat. Obviously, this is all in the context of the fact that we have seen not just the Americans pull the JCPOA, but a hurrying of efforts both by the Israelis and regional powers like the Saudis and others to basically get really tough on Iran. They've been beating the drums of war for several months now. This is not a surprise for many of us who've been watching this. But I think in the context of the Americans pulling out of the JCPOA, it frankly, I think, unhinges the Israelis. It also, frankly, unhinges the Iranians. Both parties feel like they have less to lose now. So I think this is really a new start of something that could escalate, and I'm very, very, very fearful for what's going to come.
Yeah. Do you think that that was the plan from Donald Trump? I put this to Paul Heimbecker earlier. He thought it was rather not the idea was ludicrous, but the concept of it was ludicrous, that Donald Trump really wanted that agreement out of the way so that he could exercise muscular and threatening diplomacy, if you could put it that way.
Well, you know what? Look, I think the Trump administration, and I say administration because now we're not just talking about Donald Trump, we're talking about the people around him. You know, he surrounded himself by some of the most hawkish people who frankly have been talking about regime change in Iran for years now. People like John Bolton, Pompeo, even Rudy Giuliani. I mean, these people have been paid by, a terrorist organization from within Iran, recently just delisted by the Americans themselves, the MEK group, that have been talking about regime change endlessly in Iran, and it's really quite sad because they've learned no lessons from what happened in Iraq.
That's what I was going to say.
That's the people who surround him.
How could someone look at Iraq and then think that a similar situation was going to work for Iran?
Right, and frankly, you know what? The problem is that Trump is listening to not just only these advisors, but he has people like the Israelis, he has people like the Saudis who are talking about regime change as somehow as though it's easy, and frankly, that the time is ripe because there is internal discontent, absolutely, within Iran itself. But I think it's a very short-sighted idea, and as we all know from how 2003 resulted, these things cannot be top-down. They really need to be organic, and this is far from being an organic revolution. This is regime change in its most brutal form, and it doesn't end well.
Yeah. What do you think the Israeli interest is here? What are they really looking for?
Well, look, Bibi Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel, has not, been shy away from saying that he wants regime change. He thinks that this regime needs to go. And, again, I have no love lost for the regime, and plenty of Iranians would like to see the regime go too. But the reality is how to do it without great harm. And not to mention, Iran is a very sophisticated society. The Iranian military and army have a very strong stranglehold over the entire system. I mean, it's just not a piece of cake. And again, back to hearkening to the 2003, we often heard this idea that people be greeting the American soldiers with flowers in Iraq. I mean, this is the exact same, scenario repeating itself. So I think it's really problematic in terms of who's in Trump's ears. And it's those folks surrounding him in the White House and people like Netanyahu, people like Mohammed bin Salman of Saudi Arabia that are frankly filling his ear with this message.
Yeah, Saudi Arabia putting out a message today, and tell me if you can decode it, saying that, or maybe it's just is what it is, saying that they would pursue a nuclear weapon if Iran pursues a nuclear weapon.
Yes, really quite interesting. Adel Abu Jubair said this on CNN. Look, I mean, this is really, I think, just kind of raising the stakes. The Saudis should have no business in trying to acquire nuclear technology. To be honest with you, I'm in this town, and all I hear about is how disastrous the Saudis have handled really high-tech conventional weapons. So they have very poor training and execution, and the last thing they should get their hands on is something as sophisticated as a nuclear technology. They just simply don't have the capacity, let alone, you know, the wider issue of let's see what they've done in Yemen and other humanitarian damages they've done across the region, they certainly should not be getting their hands on such a weapon.
Okay, so given all of this, Bessma, how do you think Hassan Rouhani, the leader of Iran, the president of Iran, how do you think that he is looking at this now and talking about it with France and Germany and Russia and others who want to save this deal? Is he thinking, well, can this deal be saved or we are out?
This is a very interesting dynamic. Let's not forget here also that Rouhani, you know, a relative moderate, you can take that for what you will, but the reality is he is being pressed by hardliners. These are not the people we want to take over power. And Rouhani, for all the flaws, you know, at least is a moderate, relatively speaking. And the hardliners are gunning for him now, and this is not good. This will make things even more repressive for the average Iranian. So they are now actually saying that, look, we told you the JCPOA, this international deal, you know, is not a great thing for us to do. This just constrained our sovereignty. It basically took away a really important technological development. Why did you give everything away to the Americans? And look what they did. They just basically turned around and scrapped the deal. So, you know, we're putting Rouhani in a more difficult position. And I think in the long term, that just makes it more difficult for the Iranian people. On the international scale, will the European powers, which have a lot to lose here because they've been rushing in with deals, signing in a lot of deals with Iranian companies. This is a lucrative market of 80 million people, very sophisticated middle class. They don't want to get out of this. There's lots of money for them. Remember, Europe has its own fiscal troubles. So will they stay? They want to stay in. Every indication I've seen from the European powers is they want to stay in. But here's the crux of it. The Americans are making it difficult for the Europeans to stay in. They're saying if your companies do business with Iran, we are going to sanction you. That's something that no European company or country can afford to do. The American market is far more important, obviously, than the Iranian one.
So they're stuck.
Absolutely, they're stuck. And, you know, this is why we saw such a barrage of world leaders come to D.C. here to come and advocate for the deal, because there were just some serious large contracts. Just today, Total of France is probably going to lose a deal to the Chinese now. I mean, this is the kind of ramifications we're talking about.
Well, Russia, just in the last minute, Russia has said that right away, it said it's willing to do a bilateral deal with Iran. And then you see Benjamin Netanyahu at Russia's door today. What do you make of that?
Yeah, I think that's a different purpose. Look, the Russians are going to do business with the Iranians no matter what. That's just not going to change. They frankly don't care about what the Americans do. They're being sanctioned by the Americans themselves. So what makes the difference, right? There's no point in worrying about that. What we saw here in terms of Netanyahu going to Russia was to tell him, you know, there was obviously the celebration of Putin coming into power, but more importantly, this was about Netanyahu telling Putin, look, I will be taking out Iranian assets in Syria, as we saw tonight. Do not interfere. Or frankly, if I can seek your permission, maybe one of those two explanations might be there. The reality is it's about, you know, telling Putin about the plans so that Putin, who has a lot of assets in Syria too, does not interfere and try to defend in some way the Syrian, lackey that they have in power there. So that's what that meeting is really about.
All right. Bessma Momani, a senior fellow at the Center for International Governance Innovation. She joined me from Washington. Bessma, thank you.
Thank you.